So, hello and welcome to this course titled The Novel and Change. We will continue discussing Charles Dickens's novel, The Great Expectations. We have already had an introductory session on this. We'll just carry on reading the essay that we had started off with. And the reason that we are looking at this essay, as you may have guessed already, is because it's a very good study of the text and the context together. So, looking at the text in connection to the context, because remember, Dickens is also writing at a time where some very interesting social changes are happening or taking place. And of course, we need to remind ourselves that we are reading Great Expectations in comparison and in dialogue with Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness, which will begin once we finish reading this. So, if you just go back to where we left last time, we were talking about how the whole idea of the fetishization of identity, the conversion of the entity into a commodity, that is taking place in a very industrial speed and scale in Dickens's England, the time in which Great Expectation is emerging. So this is a novel where masculinity, identity, gentlemanliness all become part of the cultural commodity processes. And of course, the whole economy of aspiration, the whole economy of expectations around the subject, all oriented towards this very, very market heavy identity process. Now, we also find that the novel is also about journeying, how Pip moves from rural England to more metropolitan England, and that movement is also associated with the loss of innocence, a movement very symbolic, as it were, from the idyllic pastoral landscape to a more almost cannibalistic cosmopolitan landscape, and that is obviously in connection with the social changes happening in England at that point of time. So this should be on the screen. Um, and if we just before we just begin, if you remember how the vocabulary in Great Expectation also sometimes draws on a very machinic vocabulary, the whole idea of the machine, the whole idea of the assemblage between the man and the machine, that begins to inform the different cognitive, emotional processes in the novel. So, Great Expectations dramatizes Pip's crisis of identity as a direct consequence of his migration from the rural economy of his boyhood to the remorseless capitalist exchange of the city. So there's absolutely no remorse, there's no compunction, there's no sympathy, there's no pity. It's very much a machinic world where everyone is racing against everyone else in order to make it to the top. This is an economy of aspirations, an economy of ambition, of making it big. So gentlemanliness becomes a very, very coveted commodity in this economy. The coercion of modernity, the juggernaut of capital, the chariot movement of capital, the very coercive structures of modernity, all this is partly figured in the text by the incursions of Pip's involuntary, unconscious, and the pain and fear of displacement that Dickens registers here. So, along with mobility, there's also a sense of dislocation. So, the obvious aspiration is towards a mobile economy, an upwardly mobile economy. That comes at a cost. It comes at a cost of, stability. It comes at a cost of, the whole idea of being rooted somewhere. So there is a sense of alienation, a sense of displacement, a sense of, uprootedness. All these come in and are dramatized in different degrees in Dickens's novel. Yet, Dickens does not allow any return for Pip, and it is only at the level of the unconscious that Pip's resistance to his experiences in London is possible. So it's only at a very subliminal level that any subversion or any resistance is taking place in his dreams, in his unconscious, in his escape into reverie, etc. Whereas in reality, he's very much sucked into the matrix of cosmopolitanism, capitalism, where he finds himself very strongly situated. Right. So this situatedness is important here because it is coming at a cost of being uprooted from this erstwhile ideally position of rural England, the countryside. So from a country boy, he very quickly transforms into a city boy, a city man, moving towards this very mobile, aspirational economy. And in the process, it is also a story about the loss of innocence. So it is not Pip's bad faith that produces his dreams, which are less dreams of conscience than are the dreamt consciousness of the bewildering logic of the cash nexus of transferable value. Dreams seem to be important in Great Expectations because they represent the beleaguered remnant of private identity in a world which increasingly demands the sacrifice of individuality to public conformity. Now, this is an important passage because the whole idea of sacrificing agency, sacrificing individuality to the service of public conformity is important over here, because all identities become part of one faceless automatic exchange. And the metropolitan modernity that London represents in its novel is part of a sucking machine where it sucks up all human agency, all individuality, all differences, and it literally transforms humans into factory-produced products. And the whole idea of gentlemanliness, the whole idea of the self-fashioned gentleman, and the movement towards the urban capital, the movement towards the aspirational identity, is also part of this this entire mechanism of producing agency-lessness, which is what is taking place in Great Expectations. And the very title of the essay, if you can sort of focus on the idea of expectations over here and Great Expectations, it has a sense of failure embedded in it. So Great Expectations, it also seems to suggest that maybe the expectations are not met. Maybe there's a sense of failure, a sense of collapse, a sense of the crisis of expectations that is also taking place. So at the level of greatness, there's a sort of pressure and the whole idea of going for something which is a chimera-like construct. So the very oppositions which Marxist claims are threatened by industrial capitalism are those violated in Pip's dreams, what Mark Selzer has described as the opposition between the personal and the commercial, between private and public, between persons and material objects, right? So these things keep featuring in Pip's dreams. And again, dreams are important over here because they offer some kind of a ludic landscape, a subversive landscape, which allows for these oppositional categories to mix and merge together, right? So dreams become not just an escape route for Pip, but also some kind of play where he can project his fantasies, his fears, his phobias, which are otherwise very, very constricted and repressed in this very mainstreaming straitjacket of individuality and gentlemanly behavior that London compels a subject to produce and perform and conform to. In view of Pip's vivid dreams, the famous charges made by George Orwell that Dickens's characters have no mental life, and by G.H. Lewis that Dickens is unable to render the complexity of the organism, seem unfounded. So there are these very long, drawn-out scholarly criticism of Dickens, how his characters are never really ones of flesh and blood. They're not really animated characters. They're not really deep, rounded characters. They seem to be sometimes stereotyped, sometimes very stock characters. That criticism seems to be a little bit challenged and undercut in this reading. And that criticism, as you know, has also come historically from George Orwell, who very famously said Dickens's characters have no mental life. There's no mental depth. There's no sense of emotional complexity. And that, to a certain extent, is exposed as unfounded because there is a lot of mental ambivalence and depth and anguish and anxiety that we find in Great Expectations. So, unsurprisingly, in Great Expectations, dreams, visions, and anxieties continually invade the narrative, and Pip refers often to his mental life. So there are all these different subliminal traffic going on in terms of the subconscious, the unconscious, the dreams, the reveries, the different kinds of fantasies and phobias and anxieties, which keep informing and shaping and reshaping each other, sometimes undercutting each other. And all these create some kind of an economy of mental movements, economy of moods, economy of aspirations, which become part of the characterization in Great Expectations. So, so Pip refers to this his mental life, my inner self, my state of mind within myself, and the innermost life of my life. So this whole idea of inwardness, the whole idea of interiority, self-reflexivity, so all these become important in Great Expectations. So it is in some sense unlike many other Dickens's novels, where the function of the characters is to progress the plot, is to push forward the action in the story, in the plot. Whereas in Great Expectations, sometimes we have really dense descriptions and very detailed self-reflexive descriptions of the character's thought processes, Pip's thought processes. So in that, it seems to be quite quote-unquote modernist in quality. You know, it's a bit like the James Joyce idea of the unconscious, or the Virginia Woolf idea of the unconscious, where depth and interiority and subliminal, subconscious, all these become very important categories of categorization. Right. So Peter Brooks, among others, in his well-known psychoanalytic reading of Great Expectations, noticed the psychological narrative and has diagnosed the end of the novel as dramatizing. There's a quote from Brooks: "The return of the repressed as knowledge of the self's other story, the true history of his misapprehended desire, which forces a total revision of the subject's relation to the orders within which it constitutes meaning." So again, the vocabulary is very Freudian, as you can see, the return of the repressed. And what kind of return is this? The repressed as knowledge of the self's other story, right? So the whole idea of the other story, the dark story, the shameful story, which we talked about in the early class as well. The whole idea of finding out or arriving at the moment of knowledge where you realize the entire subjectivity is an inglorious construct, an inglorious subjectivity, a shameful subjectivity, right? So the true story of his misapprehended desire. So it is a misdirected, misapprehended desire, because obviously in the story, Pip, he's expecting that, or he thinks that, it's Miss Havisham who is funding his education, funding his gentlemanly upbringing, whereas in reality, it turns out there was a conflict Magwitch who is funding it all the time. So that becomes a bit of a misapprehended desire. So that this whole sense of the pursuit of excellence, the pursuit of social supremacy, it begins to become some kind of a hollow act, because you realize that it's only possible if you are using very, very questionable money, very dark money from very dark sources. So it is a total revision. It forces a total revision, as Peter Brooks says, of the subject's relations to the others, within which it constitutes meaning. So the entire self-other binary, the entire acceptable, unacceptable binary, the entire desirable, undesirable binary. So all these binaries begin to blur away in this very revisionist force which this particular awakening compels the subject to experience. So although Brooks's idea or discussion in the novel is compelling, I'm arguing here that a state of hypersubjectivity, a very important word, hypersubjectivity, the self-reflexive awareness of the self, almost in a very metacognitive way, the awareness of awareness, the subject's understanding of his own subjectivity, so hypersubjectivity. The state of hypersubjectivity which Dickens attributes to Pip is actively constituted by the main plot, the plot which Brooks describes as centrally, unashamedly, and at first place, unsurprised or unsuspiciously concerned with issues of plot and plotting, right? So the whole idea of issues of plot and plotting, as in how to make the plot forward, how to design the plot. So these things also become part of the narrative in a certain sense. And we also have moments in Great Expectations where we realize that it's almost like the narrative is trying to figure out a way how to navigate it forward. So there is a self-reflexive quality in the narrative as well. And this is important because the manner in which the narrative is designed, the manner in which the narrative is operationalized, in a way, is also dialogic with the manner of self-reflexivity that Pip's own subjective experience, forces him to undergo or go through. So Pip is coerced by a self-help culture into an active involvement in this capitalist plot, the mystery plot of his expectations, and a crowd of speculations and anticipations which attends it, produces a confusion of his identity and his sense of victimization, which Dickens dramatizes in The Dreams. So there is a sense of victimization, a sense of being discriminated, being humiliated, and that often comes up in Pip's Dreams. But more importantly, what is important over here is the whole idea of the plot, the mystery plot, in the sense that, and also notice how the word plot is spatial in quality as well. It's territorial, spatial, how it can only give some kind of there's a legality about plot. There's a difference between a land and a plot. So the plot belongs to someone. The plot is a classified territory. The plot has a sense of inclusion, exclusion, transgression. The permitted perimeter of the plot as opposed to the transgression of that same perimeter. So all these different legal, existential, emotional, affective issues come together in this metaphoric plot. Now, of course, the whole idea of plot is important because it is also the way in which the borders between the public and the private, between the whole idea of security and social mobility and insecurity, they all begin to blur away, right? And of course, there's a sense of mystery in the plot as well, as I mentioned already, that there is this constant speculation about why or who is funding Pip's education. When it turns out in the end it was the convicts' money, then of course the plot comes to an abrupt change. It has to be directed somewhere else, right? So, and this sense of victimization, which Dickens dramatizes in The Dreams. Furthermore, there is no redemptive recognition or return possible for Pip at the end of the text, enmeshed as he is by then, in a newly literate and commercial society which excludes the unwritten, the private, and the dreamt. So again, the whole sense of the capitalist market economy that Pip finds himself situated in very squarely, it has no room for dreams. There's no room for the unwritten, for the liminal. So everything has to be classified, in a very cartographic kind of a way. So there's no sense of the private and the dreamt and the liminal making any impact in the commercial conversations that are taking place, between subjects, right? So Dickens was fascinated by dreams and the nature of the relationships to personal identity. In June 1866, Dickens told his friend G.H. Lewes, "Curious stories of dreams, etc., a case of inconsequential dreams seeming to come true in the most minute details, and examples of a strange effect which shock could have on people's behavior and perception of themselves." Right. So, as you can imagine, Dickens was profoundly influenced and profoundly interested in the different psychological, almost neural mechanisms through which people's behavior, perceptions can be altered, redefined through states of shock, through states of shudder. So there is this constant curiosity Dickens has in terms of what happens, or trying to find out what happens to the subject, the feeling, experiencing, lived subject, when they come by a very, very extreme experience. And in the spring of 1870, Dickens had lunch with Lewis and George Eliot and talked of the dreams again. Again, George Eliot, of course, was one of the best novelists of the time, in terms of the realism, in terms of this tension between the countryside and the city. So all these things happen in Eliot's novels as well. Right. So Lewis's professional interest in psychoanalogy probably made him an attentive listener. Many of Dickens's friends were psychologists or interested in psychology. Apart from Lewis, he knew John Connolly, William Thackeray, Charles Reade, John Foster, Richard Monckton Miles, and Brian Proctor. Among them were 3 government lunacy commissioners and 1 co-proprietor of an asylum. So it is an interesting mix. We have these writers as well as asylum owners, right? So again, what we see in common is a discussion about the mind, the state of mental health, etc. So in Great Expectations, he renders psychological phenomena with surprising accuracy. The young Pip is able to recall what I hardly knew I knew. So the whole idea of recall becomes important. Recall is reconstruction, and how that can sometimes happen even with the subject not controlling it entirely. So the uncontrollable nature of memory, that too becomes an important factor. Just as G.H. Lewis, in the second volume of his The Physiology of Common Life, published in 1860, tells us, and there's a quote, "We can have a sensation without thinking of that sensation. And in like manner, we can think without thinking that we think." So there's this double negation over here. We think without thinking that we think. So this whole idea of rescuing the mind from thinking, the whole idea of having a sensation without the necessarily going through a thought process which shapes it. So these things become important. The older Pip in mortal danger, trapped in a lime kiln with a murderous Oleg, is described thus: "In the excited and exalted state of my brain, I could not think of a place without seeing it, or of persons without seeing them. It is impossible to overstate the vividness of these images, and yet I was so intent all the time upon himself, who would not be intent on the tiger crouching to spring, that I knew of the slightest action of his fingers, right? So the whole idea of, uh, looking at the other, in this case, the other being the murderous Oleg, the object, the other subject. So these become very important because the vocabulary is very self-reflexive. The vocabulary is very visceral, and the viscerality of the vocabulary is important for us to understand because there is this very dense cognitive condition that Dickens is offering over here, which is very unlike to his other characterizations in other novels. Through Lewis and others, Dickens may have been familiar with the work of Henry Holland, whose investigations into the basis of identity and consciousness seem almost to offer a commentary on Dickens's technique in Great Expectations. So this is an important name, Henry Holland, who researched on identity and cognition and consciousness. And interestingly, it is very interestingly dialogic and resonant, and it corresponds to Dickens's own technique of narrative transmission. And we now refer to some of the works of Holland. For example, in 1840, Medical Notes and Reflections, in a chapter entitled On Dreaming, Insanity, Intoxication, etc., Holland writes of, and I quote, "The natural function of mind by which we perpetually change our relation to external objects, even when these all the senses are open and awake, at one moment abstracting our consciousness from them altogether, at another admitting some sensations, while others are excluded. These unceasing changes, which in the series make up the chain or circle of life, being sometimes the effect of the will, sometimes wholly beyond its control." Right. So this whole idea, the whole interplay of will, willfulness, and agencylessness, being in control or being out of control. So that is seen as a binary which has been deconstructed, especially in this novel. And this, of course, the passage I just read was in this really interesting chapter called On Dreaming, Insanity, and Intoxication by Holland, that Dickens seemed to mention as someone that Pip knew. So, of course, Dickens was aware of Holland's work. I mean, and this was a time, again, if you go back to a reading of Mary Shelley, you realize that writers like Shelley and Dickens and Defoe, these are very curious people, and they are deeply influenced, and they are deeply aware, and they engage with the scientific, political, philosophical, thesis and debates happening around that time. So Dickens's interest in dreams, states of consciousness, identity, and the freedom of will in Great Expectations clearly reflects contemporary scientific debate around such subjects. But he uses powerful descriptions of mental states to figure an identity continually under threat of collapse. The perpetual changes that Holland describes as natural sense responses to stimuli, becoming for Pip a forced defense against the relentless battery of novelty, strangeness, and violence which assails him. Right? So how mental states, these different kinds of stimuli, sensations, these become paradoxically the only way the subject could defend themselves against this relentless battery of innovation, the relentless vocabulary of violence, which the metropolitan modernity was subjecting them to. So the subliminal escape of the dreams, the subliminal escape into the unconscious, they always become the only available routes to escape when the subject finds himself mired in this metropolitan modernity of velocity and violence and viscerality. Right. So we come back to the dream where Pip describes himself as a bricks and machinery, and that famous passage that we described last time as well. So Pip's dream of his transformation into bricks and machinery is a last in the novel, but other dreams are recounted throughout the text. As a child, Pip dreams that he is drifting down the river to the hulks to be hanged, and he develops a dread of the file that he steals from Magwitch. In my sleep, I saw the file coming at me out of a door without seeing who held it, and I screamed myself awake. So even when he is with Magwitch, when he's in other situations, the dreams, the density of dreams keep coming back in Pip's mind. And again, on the eve of his move to London, Pip dreams again. All night I lay, all night there were coaches in my broken sleep, going to wrong places instead of London, and having in the traces new dogs, new cats, now dogs, now pigs, now men, never horses. So this is important because first of all, there's a sense of the coach moving from one place to another place, and that itself is a sign of mobility and the associated anxiety with it. But also at the same time, the whole idea of seeing many animals becomes important, but never horses. I mean, horses is pre-industrial revolution, part of the vehicle, part of the locomotive, part of the moving machines, but never horses. Horses are very, very interestingly and symbolically erased, or they don't appear. In London, Pip miserably dreamed that my expectations were all cancelled, that I had to give my hand in marriage to Herbert's Clara or play Hamlet to Miss Havisham's course before 20,000 people without knowing 20 words of it. Right? So he's the moment of despair when he gives it all up and says, well, I'm just going to quit it. Now I might become an actor and do some terrible scenes, which will create a lot of mockery and resentment. Right? So, again, this is something I discussed already. When we talk about the title Great Expectation, there is this spectral projection of fear of failure, and you almost begin to expect that, but the focus is so much on expectations that maybe there is a chance, there is this possibility that it will meet a colossal failure. So, and returning to Satie's house as a young man, 1,000 Miss Havishams haunted me. So the spectral quality is there in the novel as well. She was on this side of my pillow, on that, at that head of the bed, at the foot, behind the half-opened door of the dressing room, in the dressing room, in the rooms overhead, in the room beneath, everywhere. So Miss Havisham becomes this very spectral, uncanny, ubiquitous presence. Right. When Magwitch reappears in Pip's life, I had the wildest dreams concerning him and woke unrefreshed. Like the bricks and machinery dream, all these are dramatizations of displacement. So they're getting the subject's going to displace from one place to another place, and that obviously adds to his crisis, sense of alienation. The anxiety underlying each one is an anxiety provoked by things being in the wrong place. The file achieves an autonomous identity. Miss Havisham fragments into a multiple image and fills Pip's room. Horses are replaced by pigs, and Pip has to take first Herbert's place in marriage, and then Mr. Whoopsall's is in the play. So there is a hallucinatory quality about his dreams. They just sort of feed each other, connect to each other, disconnect to each other. So that spectral hallucinatory quality of dreams also allows us to offer some kind of a throwback in the resistance against the market, because in the market everything is tangible and classifiable and tactile to a large extent, and bought and sold with some standard commercial exchange notes or values. But in the dream, all these distinctions blur away. In the dream, the public is also the private. In the dream, the whole idea of functionality or demarcation based on functionality also does not exist. At a simple level of plot in a text which famously divides Pip in two, both the younger unknowing and the older knowing identity. So this is the trick in Heart of Darkness, in Great Expectations as well, where a very old Pip, a much more mature Pip, is telling what happened to a less mature Pip. So it's a flashback story in some way, right? So there is a sense of knowing and old and unknowing and young, and all those different personas, narrative personas, they begin to blend together, right? So the dreams allow Dickens to dramatize Pip's unconscious uneasiness, which is both expressed and simultaneously repressed in the dream. So again, expression and repression go hand in hand in this particular situation, right? But the dreams dramatize more specific uneasiness too. Karl Marx writes in a section of Das Kapital that's called the fetishism of commodity. So again, we're back to this whole idea of commodification and how that produces alienation, and how to resist it. Maybe dreams are the only recourse to go back to some idyllic, unbroken past. So Karl Marx writes in a section of Das Kapital called The Fetishism of Commodities that quantities of value vary continually independently of the will, foresight, and action of the producers. To them, their own social action takes the form of the action of objects which rule the producers instead of being ruled by them. This rebellion of things. So again, this is interesting how things seem to have a life of their own, and one can think of using something like Thing Theory by Bill Brown, where things animate themselves again. They don't need a father figure or a human presence to control them anymore. So what happens in that condition? So this rebellion of things, which perform their actions independently of the will of the producer, is clearly suggested in Pip's dreamlike dream life over which, though his producer, he is a producer, he has no control. So again, what we can see how the whole idea of going against the norm, going against the normal standard is present in Great Expectations as well. But what is important here, most importantly, is the whole idea of rebellion of things. Now, mind you, the essay doesn't say objects, it's things. So there is a difference between objects and things over here. Things may be seen as objects which have crossed or transgressed the utility perimeter. So no longer are they answerable, no longer are they attached to a subject, but things begin to operate on their own, almost independently, and in a very intersectional way. And that becomes a problem. And that also becomes part of the commodity fetish and the market economy in which Great Expectations is situated. So this is a rebellion of things. So he has no control. So Pip, ironically, has no control. He cannot prevent the life, the file, or the pig, or Herbert's Clara moving autonomously into the wrong place. And furthermore, the displacements and muddling of categories, this very porous, blurry borderline, as I mentioned, within the dreams also commence on economy fatally disconnected from the actual sense of production. So this also goes to show why the English economy was almost bankrupt at that time, right? Because that difference between dreams and reality, the tangible and intangible, began to blur away. Pip's bewilderment and loss of self in the dreams echoes his uncertainty about the material source or agency of his wealth and urban identity, right? So he's not sure who funded his urban identity process, who funded his wealth for schools and education and different kinds of expensive institutions. Now, of course, this is veiled to him, which is veiled to him. And there's a quote: "In my sleep, I saw the file coming at me out of a door, without seeing who held it." The dreams mimic the attenuation of agency in capitalist marketplace, the uncertainty and veiling of the agency of production. In Marxist terms, it is in fact money which affects this veiling process. So when you use the word veil, there's a sense of translucence as well as opacity about veil. So you can sort of see through a little bit, but at the same time it's opaque. It is covering the real intention, it's covering the real agenda at work. The social relations effectively concealed by the veil of money in Great Expectations are, of course, crucial to the novel's uneasy investigation or the power of currency to outrun all social control in a market-free economy, right? In a free market economy. So the power of currency, the power of capital, which can rebuild values, which can crisscross values, which can bring up different kinds of a value economy, right? Pip's fantasizing of Miss Havisham's agency is in the place of Margaret's, reveals the ease with which such veiled and displaced origins may be misattributed. Compensation is, of course, a former and a linguistic games which Dickens plays with Joe's honest forging, in the sense of creating use value, and compensance forgery, in the sense of concealing the origin of his writing to fabricate exchange value, serve to underline the novel's anxious preoccupation with production and anxiety. So I stop at this point today because I think it's important for us to understand or calibrate the anxiety over here. It's a moral panic, of course. It's also an existential panic because there seems to be a sense of how this whole over appropriation of production and agency, where agency goes for a toss, this over appropriation of classification and gentrification and giving it a name, it also creates a new kind of social darkness, a new kind of an underclass people, right? which begins to become a problem in this novel and also elsewhere, that we have seen that the system, which is so oriented towards economy, oriented towards the market, is so designed to create the next big investor, the next big businessman, that everyone else becomes secondary in the process. So the system will just move forward in an autopilot mode. So I stop at this point today, but I hope you begin to get a sense of why Great Expectations, the novel, is very important, particularly in this course, which is about the novel and change, because it represents some very interesting changes happening in that time. And how the sense of the inglorious identity also comes into being. So we know about glorious identity, transcendental identity. Here we have the sense of the inglorious identity, which is funded paradoxically by the empire, by the fringes, by a quote-unquote rogue agent of the empire. So we'll continue with this discussion in the subsequent sessions. Thank you for your attention.